Hello and welcome to my series of conversations with men and women whose ideas, vision and philosophy help define our contemporary world. My guest today is a distinguished physicist, a scientist who has had a profound impact on Indian policy making in the areas of science, technology, information technology, sustainable development, environment, a whole range of key issues. He's had a long and distinguished career. He's been a member of the cabinet looking at science, technology, education, a member of the planning commission. The list is a long one, but I will attempt in as long as I can sort of do it in one breath. The number of positions he's held: he's been the chairperson of Indian Space Research Organization, DRDO, sort of the Defense Research and Development Organization. He was the director and the head of the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, chairman of IIT, a whole range of positions that have profoundly impacted the way we look and structure and plan science and technology in India. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. M.G.K. Menon. Just looking at this issue of science in a general sense, cliched but often referred to, Nehru's reference to the need to cultivate a scientific temper. Yes. In a sense, as if it was in opposition to our traditional Indian temper. Despite the sort of huge progresses, and particularly in recent times, information technology successes in science, how far have we cultivated scientific temper, and what do you understand by scientific temper? Let's start with that.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say the answer to your question is in the negative, namely, how far have we succeeded in cultivating scientific temper? We have science in the country, we have achievements through science in the country, but if you are talking of scientific temper as Jawaharlal Nehru understood it, I think the answer is in the negative.
What would be a scientific temper?
Scientific temper essentially means that you look on any issues that come before you objectively, rationally, by reasoning, by using the powers of your brain. In fact, when you just made the point that it might be something which is not quite in keeping with the normal ambience in society, I'd like to say that in the old days it was. Many of the quotations that I can give you, for example, if you go back to Gautama the Buddha, he made a very famous statement on that. Never believe your teacher just because he is your teacher, and so on and so forth. That everything should be tested out. You should satisfy yourself that that is how it should be. And it is strange that you find this in Kalidasa, in Shakuntala, and the same sort of set of phrases come, same sort of ideas come out, which means that in the old days one did think of discussions and arguments. When you look at Adi Shankara, he usually went around the country indulging in debates, in discussion.
In a sense, I've always been struck by the dichotomy that you often see in sort of Indian civilization. That on the one hand, there is this great conviction, there is this great devotion to the scientific method. So we make a lot of progress in scientific space research and a whole range of areas. And yet you will see a scientist who will go into a temple and sort of do a puja and put a tilak on his forehead and then go into a laboratory.
Yes.
I don't know whether sort of our space program, our space launches, or the timings of the explosion of the nuclear device, there was an astrological consultation. It's perfectly possible, because we seem to live so comfortably with what is otherwise seen as a scientific temper and something sort of much more subtle, mystical.
But I must distinguish these two aspects in it, because I think there is a distinction between somebody who goes to a temple or who does puja or who has faith and so on, in the sense that you may depend on it for your own internal peace and harmony and things of that nature. But at the same time, everything else in life, you go on the basis of scientific temper, which means you allow your curiosity to play its role and so on. So it does not necessarily have to be that a person who has scientific temper has to discard everything else.
While science is being seen in India as having delivered in many areas to some people, not everybody yet in that sense, the fruits of scientific development, and in a way industrial development grows out of scientific development, but at the same time it has developed a whole range of other issues, problems, the issues that you have talked about and addressed: sustainable development, environmental degradation, of moving beyond the purely sort of utilitarian step-by-step incremental growth of science to meet our needs, and then the great proverb of Gandhi of meeting our greed instead. In terms of policy making, how do you begin to sort of try and strive to cultivate a balance so that sort of the more evil, disruptive consequences of scientific discoveries and developments, weapons of mass destruction, are curtailed or managed?
Well, actually, my background, in a sense, in many of these things, comes from the period I spent with somebody who was my guru.
Nobel laureate, Bristol.
Nobel laureate,
yes.
Cecil Powell. Now, Cecil Powell was a great physicist. He made discoveries. He invented the whole nuclear emulsion technique. He got a Nobel Prize. But over and above that, there were two things that I learned from him. One is that science is part of culture. That science is not something standalone. It's part of human creative aspirations. It arises from that. It's part of culture. The second thing, and in fact he has given brilliant addresses on that. The second thing is that science has to be related to public welfare. Now, in that, he was all for scientific advances and its application for development. That's how I grew up. That's a long time ago now. I mean, that's half a century ago. But science as I knew it then has significantly changed. And it has changed because of the manner in which science is knowledge. It results in knowledge. And that knowledge can be applied. It results in technology. Technology results in products and artifacts and so on and so forth. And the whole relationship is becoming much closer. And the periods are becoming much shorter, which means that science and technology are essentially in a symbiotic, synergistic relationship with very little time between that knowledge being transformed to technology, transformed to products, finding its way to society.
We'll come to more of that in a moment. You're watching a conversation with Professor M.G.K. Menon, distinguished physicist, but equally powerful force in the shaping of India's policies in science and technology. We'll be right back after a short break. Don't go away. Welcome back to a continuing conversation with Professor M.G.K. Menon. Do you see science as being value neutral inherently? The minute you go into the Human Genome Project, you go into stem cell research, you go into cloning, you go into many of the next boundaries that are just waiting to be pushed in science, you more decisively perhaps than you have in the past begun to confront ethical value questions. And yet the processes and the imperatives of the thirst for knowledge have a logic and dynamic of their own. Is it at all possible, is it reasonable to begin to put put boundaries around them, to put fetters through public policy and say, no, this is not what you're going to research, this is what you're going to look at?
Well, it's very difficult to put boundaries. The way I see science today is that it's as though you were in the midst of an avalanche. There's nobody who controls it, nobody who has the power to control it. It's moving ahead as this huge mass comes down, an avalanche, down a mountain slope. The snow coming down in larger and larger masses. What I was really trying to explain earlier, namely science, technology, applications, the artifacts, they all are coming together. Now, with this, what's happening is that human beings are getting used to having new toys, so to say. And you referred to Gandhiji's statement some time ago, when Mahatma Gandhi had said, there is enough for everyone's needs, but not enough for everyone's greed. So today what is really happening is the dominant feature of life is each one aspiring to these new things, the new toys. And not only that, living up or keeping up with the Joneses. And the result of it is that money which buys these has become a dominant feature. So we are getting into what's called a consumer society.
Yet, ironically, in the scientific community and those who perhaps subscribe to the scientific temper, in a value-neutral sense perhaps, there is the faith that science and technology will find the answers.
Yes.
We will, we may colonize the moon or Mars or what have you,
yes,
and somehow it is all going to work out.
That's really the issue before us today. Because I believe very firmly, when you asked about barriers being put on scientific advance, I think those barriers cannot be put, because there is knowledge to be discovered, things to be known. And so long as you have human beings and human curiosity, they will keep searching for that. When you get that knowledge, as Francis Bacon has said, knowledge is power, and you will find it is power in your hands. Question is what to do with it. And in that, I have summarized the issue. It is for human society, the same human being who has used his powers of curiosity to discover new knowledge, to also exercise the judgment on how you would benefit from it.
Well, tell us, let's sort of move to India,
yes,
and the canvas of India and the applications of this knowledge.
Yeah.
And you have held so many key positions that have shaped the contours of knowledge. Have you felt frustrated that from the high perches of 12 years Secretary to the Government of India, looking at key ministries, how much of that policy making, that vision, that large vision that you have articulated, that you brought to it, has actually trickled down to Bharat as opposed to India? And another cliched reference to this.
Actually, if I look at it, I find that in some sense we've been remarkably successful, in some sense. For example, many people do not realize or do not even understand the magnitude of what we have achieved through scientific work. The very fact that we had people like C. Subramaniam and Indira Gandhi at that time, at the political level, Dr. B.P. Pal and then the great Dr. M.S. Swaminathan in agriculture, has resulted in a situation where today we are not importing food to feed ourselves per se. We can produce enough food.
But we still have farmers who are dying, who are committing suicide.
That's a different issue. That is not really related to science per se, but our whole social structure. And that's what Amartya Sen really pointed out in analyzing first the Bengal famine and so on and so forth, that it is a matter of people getting the food, which means empowerment of money access, things of this nature. And therefore, I think what we have to understand is that we have to have a match of these various features which come together if science is to deliver to the people its fruits.
We'll come to more of that in a moment.
Yes.
You're watching a conversation with Professor M.G.K. Menon, distinguished scientist and policymaker. We'll be right back after a short break. Don't go away. Welcome back to a continuing conversation with Professor M.G.K. Menon. We were just talking about the fruits of scientific research in India and scientific development percolating down to the poor, the disenfranchised, the underprivileged. And you were saying that it was really a question of not the failure of scientific research or the implementation of it, but more the social, the political, the administrative aspects that had meant that these hadn't reached the people.
Yeah.
Tell me, you've also been a pioneer and you played a role in information technology. That is seen as one of the great success stories in the applications of technology right down to the very grassroots. What was unique and special in what were some of the key buttons that got pressed that have enabled the success of information technology, as opposed to just drinking water systems or sanitation, which are not really high-end science and technology, but involve elements of more efficient systems of sanitation, of processing sewage. Is there a technological solution to the chaos in our cities? In some ways, driving here, I was just looking at the roads and the quality of the roads, of the pavements, and feeling that and anticipating this conversation with you and saying, look, this is really just the absence of a scientific temper, because the money is there, somebody's being paid to do it, they're just building terrible roads and they're not doing their job. And they're not using perhaps appropriate technology.
Well, let me just, it is not really related to the science or to the technology relating to road building or to the designs involved. It is really related to the fact, now you've just asked a question, said building bad roads. What happens? You give it to contractors whose prime interest is making money, okay, and not delivering what they should be delivering, which is the end product, a good road. So they will make money essentially by producing a road which also gives way. The other aspect is you have not put in the necessary resources for that road to carry the traffic it's carrying. At the moment, our roads are first subject to weather, which is the heat and the monsoon and the rain, all sorts of things, namely the conditions which they are subject to by nature. In addition to that, we are subjecting them to conditions which we produce, namely the traffic, the multimodal traffic, the heavy traffic, on a scale which they never have really planned to carry. Now, in all of that, therefore, one has to plan to have that technology, that backup of science, those materials which can take all of this. That costs money.
Is there a link perhaps
Yes.
that between societies, communities, countries which are scientifically advanced,
Yes.
technologically advanced, that they have managed to be so because they have the many of the qualities that you have referred to that we tend to lack? Because you rarely see a country that has a high level of scientific, technological development and advancement with bad roads or a sense of everyday indiscipline. Is there a connection between sort of the societal priorities, framework, values, and their ability to research, assimilate, and use and apply science?
Well, there is certainly a relationship, but let me make some points, 2 or 3 very quick points. First is, most of the countries you are talking about have had education in some sense. Therefore, they can access the world of knowledge. That's an important aspect. The second point is, many of them have reached a stage of development at an earlier period when the world was their oyster, so to say, and they were able to pick up the resources for the purpose. Now, if you look at the great cities that you have in many of the places in Europe, they came at a time, London and Paris and so on, they all developed at a time when you really didn't have the present type of middle class. You had a development which took place with resources which came in from even elsewhere through conquests and empires and all sorts of. I'm not going into the historical background for all of this, but that's what happened. Whereas our development is now taking place in a new situation, post-independence. That's what we have to really consider. The other important feature is that we've had a population growth, and therefore the load which we face in our country, in our cities, even the point that I made about the requirements of food is related essentially to that population. Now, in fact, if population had stabilized and had not grown, then we would have an abundance of food. But now what's happening is that with the population growth, we have to keep on growing more food, and since the arable land is limited, one would have to go to new technologies, including new biotechnologies, genetically modified organisms and so on.
Which are both sort of controversial and valuable. Yet ironically, that we now have an economic model which sees India's burgeoning population as an asset, which was at one time seen as a huge liability. But just sort of at a personal level, have you felt sometimes intimately personally frustrated that here's a scientist, you worked with a Nobel laureate, great opportunities to do research and development yourself and focus on those primary areas, and you sort of sacrifice that for this immense, huge contribution to scientific administration, scientific policy. So was there ever a sort of a tension between the innate scientist in you who wants to sit down, well, maybe even sort of, the eccentric professor in a laboratory, and as opposed to this public face of science?
Let me just give you a let me give you a little background to that. I would normally have been in the field of medicine. That's what I wanted to do. My father wanted me to do law. That is his profession and the profession of a whole lot of our my brothers-in-law, my uncle, and so on and so forth, my grandfather. I took to science because of C.V. Raman. And it is he who really insisted that I should do physics, do research, and go ahead, number one. So, the back of my mind, I always was thinking of medicine. And in medicine, one of the dominating features is service to society. That's one. Second is I went and I had some very good experiences in science, including working with Cecil Powell, as I said. But he was also one who was deeply concerned about society. He was one of the signatories of the so-called Bertrand Russell Einstein Manifesto against the whole question of nuclear weapons and so on. Now, from him, I got a very good feeling about cultural aspects, development aspects, the importance of science for society. The other persons who influenced me were Jawaharlal Nehru, who, when I first met him, of course I met him earlier in India, in Jodhpur and so on, but when I met him in London, he said, you must come back and work for India, in India.
What next for you?
And then I met Homi Bhabha, and when I came and joined, and I had decided to come back to India and do science in this country. So when I met Homi Bhabha, here was a brilliant physicist who would any day have won a Nobel Prize had he continued to stay abroad. Even in India, he could have won it if he only did science. But instead of that, worked on the whole atomic energy program because he felt convinced that energy was the key for development. And you needed massive amounts of energy. And what better than something which would give you a factor of 1,000,000 going from electron volts to millions of electron volts.
Having been through that very rich process,
Yes.
at this stage in your life,
Yes.
what next?
Well, I'd still like to continue to see that science gets applied meaningfully. But I'd like to go back to the point you made earlier, and that is, you asked about ethical questions. Because I do believe very strongly, because I have a strong social conscience. I feel for the poor. I feel that science must be used for their benefit, not to make the rich richer, not to produce more toys for the rich, but to produce what is required by the poor. You mentioned about water. I had mentioned about food also. You talked about sustainable development, about displacement of people from where they are, and so on and so forth. We have to find solutions. I do not think there can be any solution to these problems we face in the country or in the world outside science. Because what is science? Science is knowledge. And science enables you, therefore, to get that knowledge which can then be applied. Now the question is, how do you apply it? And today my concern is essentially that the application is by people in the interests of making money, which means for the rich.
Thank you,
That
Professor
is the-
Menon.
that's the problem.
In celebration of that commitment to the people, this is a great honor and a great privilege to host you on this program. Thank you very
Thank you.
much, sir.
Thank you.
for sparing the time
Thank
for
you,
us.
Rajiv.
Thank you, sir. And I apologize that I had to cut